Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video on Aristotle's Metaphysics. There are a lot of things to say about Aristotle, and I'm really excited to be able to start our little Aristotle unit adventure here together. The first thing that I should really note about our engagement with Aristotle is that we're just doing the littlest, tiniest bits of Aristotle, right? Um, for this week, for example, the week that we're going to spend on Aristotle's Metaphysics, we're only reading book one, right? There are various subsections. You don't even read the whole thing of book one, right? Of the Metaphysics, which is composed of several books, like 10 or 12 or something. And you're only reading, some very small segment of Aristotle's Metaphysics. And so consequently, for this class, our treatment of Aristotle and Aristotle's Metaphysics therefore can't have the same sort of treatment that we were able to give Plato, right? We were doing Plato for a very long time, like 8 weeks or something like that, right? Which I think is totally necessary to even just get all of the essential stuff with Plato. I mean, I wish we read the whole Republic, which, by the way, is being offered next semester, so check that out. As a graduate level course if you're interested. But yeah, we couldn't even do, all of the most exciting Plato together, right? And so our treatment of Aristotle here is unfortunately, pretty short. Aristotle, was an intellectual behemoth at the level of Plato. I mean, there's a reason why, for example, in the School of Athens and other classical, sort of painting about depicting ancient Greece, that it's always Plato and Aristotle together. Plato and Aristotle are often considered to be the most important philosophers, maybe in Western civilization, maybe in the world, right? Depending on your point of view. And so, the amounts that we're able to really get into Aristotle's metaphysics is unfortunately, pretty meager. We're not even discussing all of the major points, really, of Aristotle's metaphysics, but only just beginning to really get a handle on what he thinks, the field even really is before we even get to his particular answer, right? So that's all just to say that you should view this class and also the upcoming classes on Aristotle really just as introductions. These are not comprehensive in any way whatsoever. And if you take another class, then you might deal with some of the texts that we can only deal with in a sort of cursory manner in a lot more depth. So, for example, the Nicomachean Ethics, which is what we're going to read for Aristotle's Ethics, which is, I think, in a few weeks from now, you might read this whole book, right, in an ethical theories class, for example. But sheerly because of scheduling and other sort of concerns and wanting to give you as wide, a sort of introduction to Greek thought as we can, we simply don't have the opportunity to get into the amount of detail that Aristotle frankly deserves. So that's the nature of our investigation. We have to try to take what we can out of the limited investigation that we can get in the context that we have, right? And there are several things to note before we even get into the topic, just textually, about the way that Aristotle approaches doing philosophy. Some biographical facts include that Aristotle was actually a member of Plato's Academy for quite some time, right? So he probably knew Plato. He certainly discusses, even in the reading that we were doing together, some of Plato's esoteric doctrines, things that are not actually within any of his published writings that we know about. Which indicates, some intimate familiarity with Plato's teachings. And unlike Plato, Aristotle does not present his philosophy in the form of a dialogue. It's much closer to the way that people pursue philosophy today, right? And more, you might say, normal pieces of philosophy, just in the sense that they're organized, by topic. Aristotle normally has a thesis. He has some view that he's arguing against, right? And so that way it's more traditional genre, we could say, for philosophy. It's sometimes said, actually, that Aristotle did write dialogues and stuff like that, but that we don't have them. There's, no way of ever confirming that. There's no way of really knowing that for certain using the available historiographical evidence. But some people claim, I believe Cicero is normally attributed with saying that Aristotle also wrote a whole bunch of stuff that we don't have, including dialogues, and he said they were really good. So that's kind of weird, interesting, right? It speaks to the fact that our knowledge of Aristotle is partial and somewhat fragmentary, right? Just to give you another example of this, the Metaphysics, which we're reading together, it's the book that, really that coins this name, that is like when we go back and we call what Plato was doing metaphysics, we're using this Aristotelian term, right? Even an Aristotelian way of thinking about or approaching the philosophy, right? And despite this, despite how important the book is, it's essentially lectures that Aristotle would give to his students that were sort of mashed together, that were composed into something semi-readable, and then bam, that's the Metaphysics. Aristotle probably did write something more systematic, probably did in some way contribute something more different than the notes and stuff that we really have, but this is basically what we have to deal with, and this is what the philosophical tradition has been reading for, thousands of years at this point. And so Aristotle writes his philosophy a lot more in the form of an argument, but even that, the way that he frames his arguments is a little bit unusual. Aristotle will do something that's not really common for philosophers, and will constantly be pointing to other people's opinions and actually to real life examples. So, for example, if Aristotle was like, oh, I want to know what desire is, for example, he might say something like, okay, well, there are accounts of desire that were given by the vulgar, given by the people, right? And then there are accounts of desire given by certain kinds of philosophers, and then he'll start talking about that. And he wants to kind of say, okay, each of these perspectives or points of view gets something right, but it seems like they're missing something else, right? And so Aristotle's philosophy is often a little bit eclectic, you might say, mercurial, which just means that it kind of seems like he doesn't get to the point right away. Like he's talking about all these different perspectives or points of view. That's kind of like a dialogue in some way, maybe sort of inspired by the dialogue format, right? Before he gives his own considered accounts, usually at the end, right? And that's just part of his method of philosophy. If you look at Raphael's School of Athens, for example, right? If you look, or really any classical depiction of Plato and Aristotle, Plato is always pointing up, right? And Aristotle is pointing down, right? If you're too Platonic, you might read this as like, oh, Plato's pointing you to heaven and Aristotle's pointing you to hell, right? No, that's not right. That's not what Aristotle intends, or even what's intended in this depiction of Aristotle in these classical paintings. He's not pointing you to hell or even necessarily to just matter. He's pointing you to particulars, right? One thing about Aristotle that is different from Plato is that Aristotle was always very, very concerned with particulars, right? He was, we can say, at least in the Western tradition, the first biologist. He was the first person to go out and like really study animals, really study animal and plant life, and try to figure out what human beings are in relation to these. He was, you know, in a way, kind of like one of the first natural scientists ever. And he was constantly interested in trying to make philosophy accord with our ordinary, regular, everyday, commonsensical point of view. And so Aristotle, much more than like Plato, for example, will tend to um, write off or critique like philosophies like Pythagoreanism or Parmenideanism, right? Philosophy that wants to deny, for example, the reality of the senses and so on. He will often give them, pretty harsh criticism as examples of like how philosophy goes wrong, right? It leads you away from the things that you already believe, and instead of clarifying, instead of satisfying your desire to know, right, you assert there is nothing to know, right? So that's, for example, how he reads Parmenides on motion. Motion is something really hard, difficult to understand. Aristotle says Parmenides realizes this, but instead of satisfying our desire by giving a true account of motion, simply denies that there is motion, right? And so Aristotle begins the metaphysics by claiming that all men, by nature, desire to know. What does that mean? Well, it means that knowledge is intrinsically valuable, right? You might remember this terminology from when we were doing book 6 and 7 of the Republic, right? To say that something is intrinsically valuable is to say that it's worth pursuing for its own sake. So, for example, you would choose to be able to see even if that didn't lead you to any, I don't know, like future benefits, simply because you think that it's valuable to know things. And Plato largely agrees with this, right? In the Republic, the senses are given as an example of something that is both intrinsically and extrinsically valuable. And Aristotle has this conception of knowledge where to know something consists in the identification of a cause, right? So I know, what you might say, for example, I know at what temperature, for example, an egg is cooked, right? At what temperature, at what level of cooking will cause it to become rubbery, to become gross, to become overcooked, right? Versus the amount that would cause it to be undercooked, right? Aristotle regularly think about like crafts, right? As a kind of knowledge. Even Plato was willing to recognize this. If you would recall in the Apology, Plato says that the craftspeople, the technicians, techne, have a kind of knowledge, but they don't know what they know, right? They overextend their claims toward knowledge. And so knowledge comes in degrees, right? You can be like the technician. You can know, say, I know how my microwave, for example, I know how to microwave things using my microwave machine, but I don't know, like, what microwaves actually are, right? For example. And this is how you might distinguish between someone who is like a novice in a certain craft or, art, for example. They might know, oh, okay, well, if you give me the tools of the right size and, it's essentially like what I've seen before, then I can do it, right? But in the case where you don't have those givens and you are forced to rely on your own knowledge, then maybe you need like an artisan to be able to do that, right? Someone who has very extensive knowledge, right? And so it's important to know that knowledge isn't just a binary, right? It's not like it's just like this person knows, this person doesn't know, right? No, to the contrary, there's like a whole bunch of stuff that all of us don't know. Some of us know some things, some of us know some other things, right? And it consists in gradations and degrees, right? Hence, our knowledge of the cause of something comes in gradation, right? The way that, like, for example, an assayer, someone who mines gold, right, can separate gold from fool's gold. That might make them like a craftsperson or a technician. But the chemist is able to give the further explanation. Oh, okay, here's why this test or this technique works in the first place, right? And so, because we value knowledge intrinsically and we pursue it for its own sake, and that knowledge consists in the identification of a cause, then we are intrinsically interested in increasing the knowledge that we can have of the causes around us, right? This is the basic idea that we have an intrinsic desire in some way to come to know the universe greater and greater, and this involves inquiries into the causes of things. And those causes get more and more fundamental until you get to metaphysics, right? Which inquires, Aristotle says, into the primary causes. So, for example, if you're a biologist, you might be inquiring into the cause of a sickness, right? And you might say that the cause of the sickness is bacteria, whatever, right? But then if you're not just a doctor, maybe you are, a scientist, biologist, whatever, right? Then you want to know what is the cause of the bacteria, right? And you go into further and further. You can always ask this why question further and further and further along until you start to ask super duper big questions like, why is there anything rather than nothing, right? You start out, you can ask like, why is Mercury's orbit like that? Which is something that a lot of people ask because it affected their ability to like navigate and stuff like that, for example. And once you ask that, you can be like, well, why are any of the orbits like that? Right? I mean, just the capacity to ask about one thing intrinsically allows you then to ask about that whole group of everything, right? And what that naturally leads to is you asking the question, well, what's the nature of the whole enterprise? Why is any of this like this? Why do we have, the sort of universe that we even have, right? So, for example, physics might be an account of how motion works, how motion is transferred upon impact of physical bodies, right? But then it would always be possible to drive that inquiry further and be like, well, what is the cause of motion? And what is motion, right? And this is exemplified by the fact that natural scientists today still ask metaphysical questions. What is gravitational force? This is a question that Newton asked, that Newton could not answer. This is a question that we ask. It is a question that, at least in some sense, we still have no answer for, right? And so, if you do physics or really any line of inquiry enough, then it naturally leads you to the most fundamental questions about the most fundamental causes. And this is the domain that Aristotle calls metaphysics, metaphysica, right? And so metaphysics is an inquiry into the primary causes. And so we can characterize that in several ways, as I've done here. Sorry, this is kind of bleh, whatever, whited out. But it'll be okay. Metaphysics is intrinsically inquiry into the most universal causes. So when we ask about the beginning of the universe, we're asking about the start of all of the stuff, right? You can start out from any inquiry, knitting, crocheting, whatever, right? You ask these why questions eventually you'll get to why any of this? Why, why in the most universal sense? There's a really, just as a funny anecdote, there was a way that this was represented in Wikipedia, where if you like clicked on the first link for every article in Wikipedia, it would eventually lead you to philosophy, right? Philosophy asks about the most fundamental stuff, so you ask questions enough, right? You always get there. That was exemplified in the way that Wikipedia was set up, for example, right? Accordingly, metaphysics is therefore theoretical rather than practical, right? Practically, what caused the beginning of the universe, or the way that everything is to be the way that it is, right? That is the furthest thing from practical knowledge, right? Practical knowledge is maybe knowledge that you can apply to particulars, and in virtue of being so universal, right, it loses its relationship to the immediately practical environment around you. Many philosophers have identified this characteristic of metaphysics as being like its downfall, like the biggest like mistake or problem with metaphysics is that it's theoretical rather than practical. But Aristotle actually celebrates this aspect of philosophy, right? It's the sense in which philosophy is a free science. You go to the engineering department and they have to ask questions that are dictated in certain ways by corporations, companies, right? What are you going to engineer? You're going to engineer bridges, for example. Well, this company, decides in a certain way how it is that you do that, right? And so practical disciplines have a specific set of tools. They have certain givens that they work with in order to work on the particulars that they deal with. But metaphysics is theoretical in that it's an expression of human freedom, not knowing for some, other desired end, but knowing for its own sake, right? And this non-practical aspect of it reflects the fact that we value it intrinsically for its own sake. Relatedly, therefore, metaphysics is the ruling science. It's what Aristotle calls first philosophy, right? In other words, metaphysics sets the rules for all other disciplines, right? Those other disciplines do not dictate the rules for metaphysics, right? And this just has to do with the fact that metaphysics is the most universal and therefore the most fundamental, right? If metaphysics describes what a being is, physics describes what a physical being is, right? So the range of physics is inherently less than the range of metaphysics. Metaphysics is therefore very difficult to know because it's the furthest thing from perception. We have no perception of fundamental reality. We have no perception of the start of the universe. We have no perception of where motion came from. None of that, right? And that's what makes metaphysics really hard, is that it's not like, practical science where we can give a definitive yes or no, it works or it doesn't work. You can, manipulate the yarn that way or you can't, right? But since we're asking about the most fundamental questions, we have no tools, right? We have no way of confirming or denying hypotheses. Nothing in perception necessarily speaks in favor of one metaphysical view over another. So then philosophy, and especially metaphysics as first philosophy, begins in wonder, right? You look out over the night sky or something, for example, and you're like, wow, how did this all get here? Why am I here? What am I doing? What is this all for? How do I live a good life? Is it going to continue? These sort of questions happen in wonder, right? In that moment where you're inspired by the world is questionable around you. But importantly, Aristotle thinks that you can satisfy this wonder, that you can in some way bring the wonder to an end through getting an adequate kind of explanation, right? So we might wonder about who it is that lives a good life, but Aristotle also thinks that we're never satisfied if we just stew in that wonder, right? The wonder is indicative of a problem. It's indicative of a questionable aspect of the universe that we don't know how to characterize, right? And hence, it must end in explanation. And so Aristotle summarizes all this by saying that all of the other sciences are more necessary in the sense of practical, right? But none are better, right? None are greater expressions of human freedom and self-determination. So briefly, let's discuss Aristotle's criticism of Plato, which happens mostly in book 1, part 6, and part 9 of what you read. And the gist of Aristotle's criticism is this, right? The philosophers thus far have pursued inquiry into metaphysics, into the primary causes, but did not take sufficient care to clarify the concept of cause. Now we're going to actually discuss Aristotle's physics, and we're going to discuss his account of the 4 different senses of cause in more detail next week. So, we got to kind of put a lid on that to some extent, but we can sort of see in his criticisms of Plato how it is that he's going to flesh this out, right? His basic concern is that we use the word cause in several senses. But because philosophers had up to this point not really inquired into the nature of the concept cause, right, they regularly equivocate. They flip between various different kinds of uses of the idea of cause and don't systematically analyze them or recognize that we're using the same word in different ways, right? You can summarize maybe the most fundamental principle of Aristotle's Metaphysics by saying that being is said in many senses, right? So there's not just like one thing that is being or something like that, and that's what metaphysics investigates, but instead we use the concept at various different levels of inquiry to mean different things. And so if we want insight into metaphysics, we want insight into primary causes, well then we better get insight into the nature of cause itself. So, just to give an example, Aristotle has this reading of the Pre-Socratics where what Thales and these other philosophers were doing is that they were investigating into the nature of the universe, taking cause in a material sense, right? So to ask what the cause of the universe is in that way to be like, well, what kind of stuff is it all made of, right? And this is where we get accounts like, oh, it's water, it's fire, it's air, it's, and so on, right? To identify the fundamental stuff of the universe is just to identify what material it's made of. And so, again, I mentioned we're going to be brief. We will be brief in this discussion of some of these criticisms of Plato's philosophy because many of them are related, right? The first criticism we can talk about is Aristotle's criticism of the concept of participation, right? Participation was Plato's word to describe the relationship between a particular and a form, right? We said that a particular participated in a form, right? So a beautiful boy, for example, participates in the form of beauty. This is what Plato would say all the time, right? And Aristotle's criticism is basically, what the hell does that mean? What does it mean to say that the younger boy participated in the form of beauty, right? sometimes Plato will use different senses for this word, right? Sometimes he'll say something like the beautiful boy had some share of the form of beauty, right? It better not be that, because then the form of beauty has parts. How many parts does it have? How do you start getting a part of beauty? What are you talking about, right? Another way that Plato will sometimes talk about participation is he'll say that like a beautiful boy or a beautiful painting, for example, uh, resembles the form of the beautiful, right? But if that's what we mean, then what does the form of the beautiful have to do with that thing, right? It's just a resemblance relationship. Lots of things look like other things, right? It seems like Plato wants to assert something more meaty, right? Than just saying that like all the particulars that participate in the form of beauty, they just look like this thing that is the form of beauty, right? But also, what does that even mean, right? I know what it means to compare an image I have with another image that I have, right? But I have no idea what I mean when I say a beautiful painting looks like the form of the good. What does looks like, right? It's not the colors, it's not the lights, it's not the lines, right? Because Plato had already discounted all of these things. So what is it, right? How do we even talk about what it means to participate in a form, right? And so this is related to the second criticism that Plato only focuses on some notions of cause. In particular, Plato has this weird, almost teleological understanding of cause, where what we mean is that the form of the beautiful is the cause of beautiful things in the precise sense that it's the end that they aim at, right? Insofar as they're beautiful or something like that, right? They're the goal, they're the norm by which we judge all of the particular instances, right? But that seems like a totally different thing than saying that, the form of the beautiful is the cause of the beautiful, right? Because one is about purpose and is more end directed. One is a causal process, so it focuses on the cause instead of the end, right? Another criticism, there are too many forms. Right? Plato doesn't really help us here. Plato doesn't really talk about how many forms there are, right? What are their forms of, right? Clearly, he says things like beauty and justice and truth and whatever, courage, piety, okay, all of this stuff. Is there a form of apples? Is there a form of red delicious apples? Does the form of red delicious apples participate in the form of apples? Does the form of apples participate in the form of the eternal? Right? Do sensuous things participate in the form of the eternal? What's going on? Right? And at one point, in one Plato dialogue that we didn't have the opportunity to read together, the Parmenides asks a young Socrates, he asks a young Socrates a question like, okay, but is there a form of dirt? Is there a form of hair? Is there a form of, a dust mite, for example, right? And in the dialogue, Plato has Socrates say, no, there isn't a form of those things. But Parmenides, who is displayed in this dialogue as very wise, Socrates' teacher, says something to the effect of, oh, you think that because you're young, right? And you want to lionize the forms, you want the forms to be of good things, right? And so on. But, Parmenides says something to the effect of, but as you get older and you get wiser, you will abandon this view, right? And so, in other words, it's not really clear how it is that the forms can explain things about the particulars if there are as many forms as there are particulars. Which raises this further question of like, what are we adding when we say that it participates in a form? What way are forms causes, right? The form of the beautiful doesn't cause the beautiful painting in the way that the painter does, right? I mean, it seems like Plato would have to say that, but then what exactly does he even mean? And then moreover, we can ask finally, right, what is the original source of movement or motion, right? We know that motion and sensible reality is fundamentally unreal. The only other thing in the universe, according to Plato, is the realm of forms. Why is there a sensible world at all? why do the forms even bother to allow particulars to exist or to participate them or anything like that, right? And so you can see that what Aristotle is trying to do is Aristotle is putting a lot of pressure on what are we explaining whenever we say, invoke the forms in Plato's philosophy. And this is the general angle of his criticism, is that Plato's notion of forms are too divorced from particulars to ever really give us knowledge of them. I'm very interested in hearing what you think. Do you agree with Aristotle? Do you agree with Plato? Where do you end up? I very much look forward to reading your discussion forum, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.